Dog Nation, it's Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hope you all had a great weekend here in the Atlanta area. There's some excitement building about the Super Bowl on Sunday. We're actually going to have some DawgNation coverage of former UGA guys in Atlanta this week, so make sure you stay tuned to DawgNation Daily for that. We've also got Chip Towers coming up in today's program. Some interesting things to get into with Chip, including why isn't it that Georgia's announced a defensive coordinator yet? This thing has dragged on now forever. We think we know who it is, but the announcement not being made yet is a little bit unusual, I guess. We'll let Chip tell us about that. Chip also wrote an interesting piece about Zamir White over the weekend that I want to talk to him a bit about, too. But before that, there is some recruiting news to get to, not necessarily the 2019 variety, but for Georgia, who's been great with running backs. It's doing some work this weekend to make sure it stays great with those running backs. We'll tell you all about that as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I hope you'll stay tuned in just a few minutes. I do have something important to tell you about the Marlowe's event tomorrow. I've got some interesting news on that. I'll give you that coming up in just a moment. Before that, though, let me dive into the news of the day as it is. And you know, here in the Atlanta area where we have DawgNation World Headquarters, where we do this show from every day, there is obviously a lot of attention on the Super Bowl right now. And from the Georgia fans' perspective, there is something really fascinating about both these teams, the Rams from the NFC, the New England Patriots from the AFC, both being led by former Georgia running back. Sony Michel had a terrific rookie season for the Patriots this year, had a big performance in the AFC Championship game. Todd Gurley is just one of the best players in the NFL, bar none, regardless of position. So it's really fun to see both those guys in Atlanta enjoying the success they're having when it comes to their NFL careers. And it's also really nice to see the affection that both these guys still have for the University of Georgia. That was on display with Gurley on, I think it was Saturday. I forget if it's Friday or Saturday. All this stuff kind of runs together. But he is in L.A. before the team makes its way to Atlanta. He's doing kind of a final press conference there in California before moving over. And if you're watching on video, you can obviously see the huge Georgia G on the red sweatshirt that he's wearing. And I got to tell you, that is a perfect commercial for this Georgia program, for this Super Bowl, to see Todd Gurley, kind of relaxed, comfortable, sporting the Georgia G. You just love to see that if you're a Georgia fan, especially in a year like this where Georgia is, or as you move towards that 2020 cycle anyway, where Georgia is looking to add those running backs, more elite running backs of the caliber that Gurley became, of the caliber that Michel was out of high school and was throughout his Georgia career. Georgia's looking for that next generation of that, and seeing Gurley splashed all over social media and national TV wearing the Georgia G, well, you got to imagine that really helps Georgia's cause. There was also one more thing on the Gurley front before we kind of get into more of the recruiting angle of this that I thought was pretty interesting. AJC, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, in L.A. to cover this, and Orlando Ledbetter was on hand in Los Angeles. And obviously, if you've got Gurley wearing the Georgia G, you got to ask him about the other Georgia running back in the game. I mean, let's face it, I'm more interested in the interplay between those two than I am virtually anything else. As you know, I'm much more of a college fan than a pro football fan. I'm excited about the game, but primarily my excitement is centered around the presence of the Georgia players in the game. So I was glad to see in L.A. Orlando Ledbetter ask Gurley about his relationship with Sony Michel. Now, I think you got to give Gurley all the credit for this, because while we are all into the, hey, look at the Georgia guys in the Super Bowl, from the perspective of Todd Gurley, he's like, that's not my brother this week. That's an enemy this week. That's a guy that I've got to worry about as a nemesis this week. And so from the standpoint of a competitor, I actually kind of liked what Gurley said about this. Here is the AJC reporter asking Gurley about Sony Michel, and Gurley essentially giving the stiff arm to that question. Take a listen to this.
You got your Georgia sweater on there. You and Sony beating up again in the Super Bowl after being together for that 1 year in 2014.
It's cool. It's cool. We on the other side though, so we ain't talking about it.
So he says, listen, he's on the other side right now. I'm not interested in talking about that kind of stuff. And you like the idea that the competitive spirit for Todd Gurley takes over right there. But you know that these two guys are proud for each other. And obviously the fun they had together as Georgia teammates back in 2014, that's going to be a big subplot and a big storyline for this week. And it could not, as I said before, be more perfect timing for Georgia as it looks to add to the next generation of that great RBU legacy. Take this weekend, for instance. Zachary Evans, one of the top running backs for the class of 2020. he was on hand in Athens. He had tweeted out some stuff. He eventually deletes those tweets, and y'all know I'm 1,000 years old. I don't always, know and understand what the social media stuff means. I don't know if it's a nothing that the tweets get deleted. I don't know if that's a serious thing that the tweets get deleted. I don't know if that's bad news for Georgia that he goes there, takes a bunch of pictures, then takes those off Twitter. It's probably way too early to tell all that kind of stuff, but it is, I guess, worth pointing out that some of the stuff that Evans put out on Twitter, identifying himself at UGA, he has since deleted those tweets, so we'll sort of wait and make sense what that means. But obviously Evans is one of those names, along with Kendall Milton and others, that you start really thinking about in terms of that next great potential Georgia running back that Dale McGee's trying to chase down. Evans fits into that conversation for sure. But there's also another name to add into that, because when I talk about running backs, I do talk about Kendall Milton a lot, but it's probably time to start talking about another name in that discussion as well. His name is Marshawn Lloyd. If you're watching on video, I'll show you Lloyd's tweet of himself there at the University of Georgia, wearing, as a lot of those recruits do, the black jersey for that. But Lloyd is a guy that, if you've been focused in on the Evans and the Milton, two names we probably mentioned here around DawgNation Daily more so than the others, it's probably about time to start thinking a lot more about Lloyd as that running back that Georgia's really going to be chasing down for 2020. The reason why I say that, the reason why I know that, is because of all the stuff that Jeff Sentell has said about that. First of all, it's not just Jeff who's excited about the potential of Lloyd at the University of Georgia. Another recruit that Georgia's also been in the mix with as of late, Brett Seither, the tight end, who could be a late addition to the 2019 class, filling a position of need for Georgia now that Isaac Nada is going to try his hand at the NFL and Luke Ford decided to transfer. Seither also had a tweet celebrating the fact that Marshawn Lloyd was on the Georgia campus. Seither obviously excited about seeing the presence of Lloyd in Athens, and as I said before, it's probably about time to start thinking a lot more about what Lloyd brings to the table. We mentioned 2020 running backs like Kendall Milton. Maybe it's time to start mentioning Marshawn Lloyd right there beside that. That's at least what Jeff Sentell tells us we ought to be doing. Let me give you an example of this. If you want to go back to Wednesday, we were having a conversation on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger. That's the recruiting show we do each and every week. Jeff asked me what I thought was a pretty provocative question. I gave an answer, and Jeff, in a polite way, said, "Hold on now, BA. Make sure you mention another name as frequently as you mention this particular name." The clip kind of speaks for itself. Here's an interplay between Jeff and me from Before the Hedges, but it's certainly relevant in light of the fact that Marshawn Lloyd was just on the Georgia campus. Take a listen to this.
I'm giving you a magic wand, which instantly puts two of these guys in the 2020 class. Just two. Which two are you picking?
With all due respect to Brian Brzee, mine are Reed Gilbert and Kendall Milton right now.
Marshawn Lloyd. Keep thinking about Marshawn Lloyd.
Okay.
He's a five-star running back.
I like Milton because of the interview you did with him, though.
So, and forget the fact that I completely talk over Jeff as he's trying to talk about Marshawn Lloyd. Put that aside for a moment. Here I am mentioning, now the question is, hey, if you can only have two of the elite 2020 recruits right now, which two would you want? I mentioned Brian Brzee, the 2020 pass rusher, and I say, with all due respect to him, mine would be the tight end, Reed Gilbert, the running back, Kendall Milton. Jeff's response there, when you're mentioning Kendall Milton, make sure you mention Marshawn Lloyd as well. And that's great news because Lloyd did just visit UGA. Jeff told us on Friday he was going to and went into a little more detail about what that visit could mean for UGA. On the heels of Lloyd being in Athens, the elite 2020 running back, here's more from Jeff on Lloyd.
Georgia, huge weekend this weekend. A lot of elite juniors are coming into town. Perhaps some of the biggest names that are going to show up, besides the official visitor and Javon Shepard for the 2019 class, who's there right now, is a five-star running back by the name of Marshawn Lloyd. Now, he's a thick, impressive, we put the highlights up on the DawgNation forum all week about Marshawn Lloyd, about 6'1", about 205, already reps out 225 on the bench 20-plus times, has a little bit of flex of Gurley, a little bit of flex of Chubb, and a little bit of flex of Sony Michel in his game, and he's in Athens right now for an unofficial visit along with a lot of other key juniors this weekend.
Now, you want to talk about a Frankenstein's monster of a running back? If Jeff Sentell's description is true and he's a little bit of Todd Gurley, he's a little bit of Nick Chubb, he's a little bit of Sony Michel, that's almost a conversation itself of which of those attributes from those three running backs you'd want to combine to make the best possible running back. but that certainly gets your attention when Jeff says this guy reminds you a little bit of these recent 3 very good Georgia running backs. And, sometimes with Jeff, obviously I'm going to be guilty of trying to read between the lines and kind of pull some things out of him that he doesn't want to say. But what I just gave you were a couple of instances where I didn't really bring up Marshawn Lloyd to him. He brought Lloyd up to us. Remember, back on Before the Hedges on Wednesday, I'm talking about Kendall Milton, and Jeff interjects to say, don't forget about Marshawn Lloyd. On Friday from DawgNation Daily, which is where that last clip came from, I'm talking about whatever, and Jeff says, hey, let me also talk for a minute about Marshawn Lloyd. When Jeff interjects those things, when I didn't, intentionally ask him about it, that usually kind of perks me up, usually gets my attention a bit. So I did go down the road with Jeff a little more about the 2020 running back who was just in the building or in Athens over the weekend. And what Jeff told us on Friday is when it comes to Lloyd, part of the value is not just the fact that Lloyd himself is an elite prospect, but it's also an area of the country that Georgia's really going to look to unlock in both maybe the remainder of the 2019 class, also going into the 2020 class as well. This is another interesting wrinkle to the Marshawn Lloyd thing, the fact that Georgia is now invading the D.C. area, that part of Maryland. Here's Jeff Sintel again.
Yeah, perhaps maybe one of the biggest central regions of talent for Georgia in the 2020 class is going to be that D.C. metro area. And you got Mikael Sherman there. That's the 5-star linebacker out of St. John's who runs 4.5s on the laser. You've got Brian Brzee. That's the nation's #1 overall prospect for 2020 coming out of Maryland. And then you've got the aforementioned Mr. Lloyd, who is, rates as the nation's #4 running back. And it is what it is, man. That gentleman named Dell McGee is going to go after 5 stars first, and then he's going to look at the national elite backs, and he's been working those guys for over a year now already.
So listen, that could not speak for itself more that Georgia is now, much the same way the 2019 class showed, the 2020 class, I guess, going to be a replica of that. A program that's really looking to recruit at the national level, going after 5-star backs in Maryland and California and Texas and wherever else. This is a program that's going to try to stretch far and wide, and the presence of Todd Gurley and Sony Michel in the Super Bowl, I would think, only helps doing that. Let me squeeze in one more mention here as well, because it wasn't just 2020 backs were on hand. You also had the 2021 back, Seth McGowan, in the building as well on a Saturday. That's a top 10 back for that class. He's also showing the black jersey as well. So, listen, the timing on this is pretty perfect. Georgia's talking to backs. They're pursuing big names, and they got Todd Gurley wearing the Georgia G all over national television. Sony Michel's going to get a lot of attention tonight. It's Super Bowl opening night. DawgNation's going to be on hand for that. And so the echo of what people say about Gurley, what people say about Michel, will reach to the Zachary Evans and the Marshawn Lloyds and the Kendall Miltons and players of that caliber. And all of a sudden, Dell McGee, who's done some great work for Georgia in the recruiting trail, may be about to regenerate this RBU reputation with some more big names in recruiting cycles to come. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you, and thank you for being with us live on video today, 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. We're also on the radio at noon with our friends in Athens on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available in podcast form wherever podcasts can be found. We're just really glad to have you with us. We will have Chip Towers coming up in just a moment, a couple of interesting things to get into with Chip when he's with us. There is one announcement that I have to give you, and I don't love having to do this, but based on the conversation we've had here this morning, this is the best overall thing. We were going to be at Marlowe's tomorrow night for a gigantic event at the Marlowe's Tavern in Kennesaw, Georgia. It was our Countdown to Signing Day event. Jeff told us on Friday we had a special guest who is likely to join us there tomorrow night. It was going to be a big, fun event. But given the uncertain nature of the weather forecast in the Atlanta area, I think the people in charge here are going to kind of let, caution be the right choice. So we're going to go ahead and postpone our event for Kennesaw tomorrow. We're postponing it now because we want to make sure that the word gets out, the message gets out that, don't be on the roads. If there's going to be bad weather, stay home, stay safe. Obviously, that's Marlowe's Tavern's #1 issue. They want to make sure the people that, come out to their taverns are always really safe in their neighborhood. So they've asked that we all stay safe tomorrow and reschedule the event in Kennesaw, Georgia for sometime in the very near future. And we indeed will be doing that. We'll be at Kennesaw, Georgia soon, just not tomorrow night as it turns out. We're going to reschedule that because in the Atlanta area where we do the show from every day, there is the appearance that there could be some snowy, bad weather coming in. So we're going to push pause on Marlowe's Tavern tomorrow. but we'll have some fun events to announce coming up very soon about being at another Marlowe's Tavern very soon, and also back in Kennesaw, Georgia, very soon as well. So I don't love having to say that. I was really looking forward to being in Kennesaw, Georgia tomorrow night, but it's probably the right call, so let's go ahead and do that, and we'll make our plans to be back in Kennesaw, Georgia again very soon. Before I bring on Chip Towers, let me also go around the doghouse here today, brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and Tony Barnhart, the longtime college football writer, is a great friend of DawgNation Daily. In fact, I'm going to try to have Tony on really soon to talk about this. Tony goes on the Paul Feinbaum show this week. You want to talk about it was actually last week. You want to talk about a perfect thread of conversation given what we started the show with today and given kind of everything that's been out there with Gurley and Michelle playing in the Super Bowl and Georgia looking for more elite running backs for the class of 2020 and class of 2021. The conversation came up on that show of, well, who are the best running backs of all time? Now, Tony is a student of college football. He could, very well, go back and tell you the stories of, every great player really in the history of the Georgia program, even the ones from before his time. He's obviously studied them and knows them well, so he's a great person to ask about this. But anytime you put a list out there, there's going to be a little controversy about what you put. So I think we have some evidence we can show of what Tony's top 15 looks like. If you're on video, you can take a look at this now. We're going to get more into this later on in the show, but he's obviously got Herschel number 1. No one would dispute that. Then he goes Charlie Trippy, kind of an old school name for number 2. You do get Nick Chubb at number 3. You don't get to Todd Gurley until number 5, and you don't get to Sony Michel until number 7 on this list. As I said, lists are going to be controversial. My guess is a lot of Georgia fans will have a strong reaction to kind of who should be that back that ranks right below Herschel. No one's going to put someone above Herschel, but who belongs just below him? That's actually a pretty fun conversation. We're going to do that a little later on today here on DawgNation Daily as we have some fun with the fact that Sony Michel and Nick Chubb, or I should say Sony Michel and Todd Gurley, are both in the Super Bowl coming up this Sunday. For now, though, let me remind you that Around the Doghouse here on DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And, they can help you equip your house with energy-efficient windows and doors, which is a great addition to make to your house. They're family-owned and operated with a national company with a branch right here in Georgia. It means you get the power and the strength of a national company, but you also get that local service that comes when you have that local branch. So you're going to want to take advantage of a great offer they have right now. You can currently get up to 40% off qualifying installations or 0% APR for 60 months. And you got to act right now because that offer is only good through February 7th. So you want to go quickly to take advantage of that. You can schedule your in-home consultation a couple different ways. You can log on to the website, which is pellasoutheast.us. That's pellasoutheast.us. Or give them a call in their Dunwoody showroom at 404-445-2979. The number once again, 404-445-2979. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. We'll have some more thoughts on the ranking, the pecking order of Georgia running backs a little later on the program. But for now, though, let's get ready to talk to our buddy Chip Towers.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Good to have Chip Towers back here today on DawgNation Daily. Always a fun conversation with him. A lot to get into with Chip. And I guess, Chip, let me start with this. I spent a good bit of time before you joined us talking about running backs. I think we talked a little bit last week about the presence of Todd Gurley and Sony Michel in the Super Bowl. This is the kind of thing that I think is going to get Georgia fans pretty fired up, especially given the fact that the game is in Atlanta, the state of Georgia where these two guys played in college. How special do you think it is for UGA to have Michel and Gurley on such a big national stage coming up this weekend?
Well, I think it's a pretty big deal. I mean, we've already seen, some video clips and social media fodder of Todd Gurley talking and Sony Michel talking, and it's not unusual. I take that back. It's unusual to have premier backs in the same program opposing each other, in the playoffs or in the Super Bowl or what have you. But these guys, actually played together. That's what makes it very unusual. It was just a short time they played together, and the only thing that'd make it better if was Nick Chubb was around in some way, shape, or form. I'm sure he'll be around a lot this week. But yeah, Georgia's running back history is very, very special, and there's a lot of teams across the country, programs across the country that stake claims to RBU or DBU or tailback U. Southern Cal certainly carried that that label for a long time. But Georgia can hold water with anybody when it comes to that. I heard you talking. I was listening in this morning about Tony Barnhart's list, and it's funny that I saw his list, and Tony and I obviously go way back. We worked together at the Journal-Constitution, and like any list, I immediately took issue with it on a couple of counts. I was like, I get that, but I don't agree with that, and there's so many different factors that go into when they played and how much they played and how their careers went while they were there as opposed to how they were in the NFL, et cetera. So it's always a fun argument, but I've looked at it closely. Alabama, LSU, Tennessee over the years. I do believe in the SEC, Auburn, of course, and Bo Jackson, that Georgia is head and shoulders above the rest of the schools in the league.
Just the overall depth of names you could mention. And Courtney Blackman, responding on YouTube, has Todd Gurley at number 2 on the list. And Chip, for better or for worse, if we really did even have something to the effect of a scientific poll, if we really went out there and really surveyed, plugged in Georgia fans about this, I'm pretty sure that Sony Michel would rank I'm pretty sure that Todd Gurley, that's what I mean to say, I'm pretty sure that Todd Gurley would rank as the second best running back in Georgia history, according to Georgia fans. Whether that's backed up by the stats, I don't know that it necessarily matters in terms of the experience of having watched Gurley play and the dazzling nature of his highlights and obviously the maddening way that he was taken off the field for his final season in UGA, at least for part of the year, due to injury and the very weird NCAA suspension. But I think for most Georgia fans, there's a pretty strong consensus that he may be the second best running back this program has produced, with obviously the exception of the great Herschel Walker. Do you agree with me that Georgia fans would probably vote Gurley number 2?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any question that Georgia fans, certainly those that we're dealing with and here and now, would all say Todd Gurley. Now, I don't really, so I didn't get to see him play. I've seen a lot of the highlights and stuff. Charlie Trippey, I don't really have many qualms with him being considered number 2 because you're obviously talking about 2 different eras of football. I mean, well, quite frankly, you're talking about 3 eras of football when you look at Herschel Walker, Charlie Trippey, and then Todd Gurley. But I would definitely put Todd Gurley in the top 3 and possibly 2. The thing about Charlie Trippey, we just didn't get to see him to play, and there's not nearly as much footage as there is of other backs. But for his day and age, I mean, there was no more dominant player, which makes him very similar to Herschel Walker. And this is a guy who was also, the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. He won championships right out of the box in the NFL. He was in the baseball draft. He played professional baseball. He was just an incredible athlete, all the way across the board. Now, Todd Gurley, I don't know what else he's good at, and certainly, nowadays everybody's a dedicated athlete in whatever sport they have. But for Todd, the frustration with him was just you didn't get to see more of him. He had the injury in his his junior year, and he missed those 4 maddening games, with the autograph gate, and if you could have seen, but I got to tell you, for my time, and I did get to, I was in school when Rodney Hampton and Tim Worley were there. I think they're probably 2 lower. I think Rodney Hampton was fantastic, and Tim Worley was as well. He was as close to Herschel as you could possibly get. Again, he didn't get to play really a full career necessarily with Georgia, but Todd Gurley, dominated every phase of the game. He came through. I mean, you think about returned the first kickoff he ever caught for Georgia, 100 yards for a touchdown. Then he comes back after his hiatus and returns another one for a touchdown. I don't care what the referees say. He was just an unbelievable player that, if you'd had a chance to see more, you just wanted to see more of him, right?
Yeah, no doubt about it. That's a great description of that. It's the highlights more so than the stats that really speak to the greatness of Todd Gurley. And, Chip, I think that's really well said. Let me transition. I want to come back to running backs before we're done because I want to talk to you about your very fascinating take on the Zamir White situation. I want to do that later. Let me get a couple issues before we get to that, though. Georgia, as it turns out, spent pretty big to steal Charlton Warren away from Florida. He was, I think, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, due to make about $400,000 at Florida for the upcoming season. Didn't make that much last year, but would have made that much this year had he stayed. Georgia's going to pay him about $600,000 to come to UGA. For me, this is kind of no big deal. I think this is what money ought to be spent on. It's not eye-opening to me necessarily when this kind of money's tossed towards an assistant coach, because I think you need these position coaches to fill out your recruiting arsenal. And for a guy like Charlton Warren, he could be instrumental both at the end of the 2019 class, but certainly in 2020. This is the kind of thing I think that Georgia should be spending money on. What did you make of kind of a new threshold for what I'm going to presume is not the defensive coordinator, for a non-coordinator assistant defensive backs coach getting $600,000? What did you think about Georgia crossing that monetary threshold for Warren?
Yeah, well, it doesn't surprise me, and you're right. Value I've come to learn in life in all different aspects, but, in coaching staffs and as well, is value is what somebody's willing to pay you, right? And, we don't know all the ins and outs about where else Charlton Warren might have commanded interest. I mean, a lot of people think that you just show up and that's the guy you want from Florida and you offer him some money and that's it. And there's usually many, many more layers involved. That you're right. He was due to, I think, to be specific, I think it was $401,500 he was due to make at Florida. I believe that was double of what his previous salary was in an escalating scale. He came there for a couple $100,000. But yeah, I'm not surprised about these salaries anymore. There's so much money coming into the game, period, especially in the SEC. But for Georgia, that's such a need position. It's an important position. I think Kirby, just the fact that you're talking about 49 days, 7 weeks that this position was open. We know for a fact that they talked to dozens of potential candidates for whatever reason. Charlton Warren's the guy they honed down on, and then it takes what it takes to get him, right? I mean, it's just like Jim Chaney. It wasn't as simple as that Tennessee just came in and threw $1.5 million a year and made him the highest paid offensive coordinator in football. That was after some negotiating back and forth. So that might have been the case with Charlton Warren. But, $600,000, Georgia's defensive staff is extremely young. And if you look in comparison to the offensive side, it is relatively underpaid. Now, some of that has to do with there's fewer coaches overall, and then Kirby has such a strong imprint on it. But I'm not. And that's what it took to get him, and I'm not surprised at all. And they talked to a lot of very impressive candidates, and obviously it was very important to Kirby and the Bulldogs to get Charlton Warren here. They did. That's the bottom line.
So we think we know who the defensive coordinator is going to be in some form or fashion. I think everybody now has decided that Dan Lanning is going to be in some way connected to that job. And I think we've probably talked about this before, but why the delay in making this announcement? Certainly there would appear to be some sort of reasoning behind this, although it escapes my knowledge. Not that I have to understand it for it to be the way that it is, but why not just come out and say Dan Lanning's the DC or Lanning's the co-DC along with blah, blah, blah? Why is this taking so long?
Yeah, that really is a good question. And sometimes, what you can't be sure of, there could be some changes on the other side of National Signing Day. I don't know that Kirby's doing that necessarily, but that tends to be the standard operating procedure really in these things is they tend to wait till after National Signing Day to clarify positions and everything else. There could be other coaches that are still getting overtures here and there, and so he's got to keep these titles and decisions in his pocket until he's sure that all the pieces have settled back down to the ground, right? So I don't know what it is, but it just tells me that there's still, some things going on out there in terms of how he's going to settle on the staff, but it's not completely settled at this point. Now, unfortunately, Kirby hasn't, relayed that to me is exactly how that's going to look. But that's the only thing I can think. And I've written it. You've said it, Brandon, on your show. We've all kind of agreed. Griff feels the same way, that Dan Lanning is part and parcel of all this. It makes sense because he had an opportunity to leave for Colorado, which would have been a great move for a guy his age to be able to take over a Pac-12 program at 32 years old as defensive coordinator. He did not accept that opportunity, and we're left to assume that was because he was given an opportunity here. And so we'll just have to be patient and see how it all shakes out when Kirby gets off the recruiting trail and decides it's time to tell us, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to pay attention to. I thought your piece on Zamir White over the weekend was fascinating, and you obviously laid out a lot of reasons why Georgia fans ought to be cautious with expecting too much from White in his first year playing, coming off now a second knee injury. And I can't dispute the facts of what you bring up, Chip, that when you look at, former elite five-star level running backs, they certainly don't all pan out at the major college level. You mentioned, B.J. Emmons and some others that, recently that haven't, kind of lived up to that billing. And obviously when you talk about an injury, there's going to be a little bit of a crapshoot in terms of what do you get in the recovery season from that, and really what do you get long-term after an injury, to say nothing of two injuries. And yet, Chip, I find myself even in that saying, if I had to make my best guess, and this is obviously a fairly significant leap, but I'm going to make it nonetheless, if I had to make my best guess as to what to expect from White next season, I'm going to say the 1,100 yards that Chubb got in 2016, coming off what I believe is a worse injury. Even though it was only one injury, it was a worse injury than what I believe that Zamir White sustained here. I think 1,100 yards for White in his first year at Georgia is not an unreasonable expectation, given the track record of running backs like White at Georgia. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would disagree with you respectfully, and
Sure.
And that's because it's interesting on several levels. Let me first say the response to my opinion piece on that was I was surprised with the ire that it created with some people because and I did mention that some of those 5-stars that did not pan out. So maybe a lot of people focused on that as I was saying that this is a 5-star that's not going to pan out. My point is not that. My point is that this is a kid who hasn't done anything yet, and he hasn't had a chance to do anything yet. And now he's got 2 knee injury recoveries, that he's dragging behind him as well. And it's just, I continue to hear the mounting, hyperbole of expectation for this guy. So my point on that was really, I'm trying to befriend that. Really, this is not my ultimate goal, but I'm being an advocate for Zamir White. I'm like, wait. Let's not put too much on this kid. Let's give the kid a chance, to get well and get acclimated and everything else before we throw all this, hyperbolic expectation on him. With Chubb, what you had when he came back, you had a proven product and you had a need, right? When Chubb came back, you knew who he was, number one, so you're going to keep feeding him because you know what he can do because he's proven it for 2 years on a major stage. So you're going to feed him. Secondly, you needed him. You knew he was better than most everybody else you had to turn to in that particular season. You don't have to force the issue with Zeus, and I think that plays into his favor. I mean, you got plenty of other guys who can carry the rock. I certainly think everything I heard about Zamir coming to school and in the interim while he was well before he was re-injured, hey man, this guy, he's got all the stuff, he's got all the parts, and I believe that. But coming off a double knee ACL injury, an expectation of 1,100 yards or something, I just don't think he's going to get those kind of opportunities to get to 1,100 yards. They may come eventually, but I think it's going to be into the 2019 season before we start seeing him get fed like a elite running back, deserves to be fed on this level. Georgia's got a lot of important stuff to play for, and he's got a very important future in front of him. They've got to protect that future and the outcome of the team before they need to, before they over rely on somebody who, has so much still to prove, not just to everybody else, but probably to himself as well.
Well, here's one thing I think that you and I are both going to agree on is when you look at Georgia over the last couple of years, having two running backs at that kind of 1,000-yard threshold has been really important to this Georgia offense. And so I think what you're saying, and this is the part that I agree with, in terms of who's going to join DeAndre Swift, assuming that Swift's healthy for a full season, who's going to join Swift as that caliber player for Georgia, it's not a given that it'll be White, and I certainly agree with you on that. So therefore, if you are Georgia or if you're a fan that just wants the best for Georgia, you've got to include the possibility that James Cook steps up into that role, or the possibility that Brian Harrion, who you've also written about hanging around Georgia, kind of finally fulfills that opportunity and that role for Georgia. You can't just rubber stamp it to be Zamir White given the uncertainty of the status. You really are hoping for the potential of White in comparison with the potential of guys like Cook and Harrion being that complement to DeAndre Swift. From that standpoint, I think you're right to say that it's not a given that it's going to be White in that role.
Yeah, well, I don't want to underplay talent, okay? Because talent, talent is clearly talent, but we see this in the NFL all the time. And where I'm going with this is Brian Harrion. A couple of different factors about him. Number one, listen, there was a lot of discussion behind the scenes and everything about what Brian Harrion was going to do. He was one of those guys that fell into the category: does he want to stay? Does he want to go on? Does he want to transfer somewhere else where he's going to get more opportunities? And I think we've seen, from Kirby in the past that he wants to keep anybody he thinks can help the team. He wants to keep them here. So I know that there were conversations that went on with Brian Harrion and Georgia's coaching staff about staying here. And I'm not saying that there's necessarily promises made, but certainly he's going to want to know, well, how much am I going to be a part of the program? Now, listen, Brian Harrion, he's the biggest back they have. I haven't seen Kenny McIntosh yet. He knows the system frontwards and backwards. Now, how well Zeus does, I don't know this, but, every play that Jake Fromm can come up there and spout out in a huddle, and, every audible that he can call at the line of scrimmage, Brian Harrion's going to recognize and know how to do it. With the offensive line that Georgia has this next year, yes, I mean, there's a difference between DeAndre Swift and the other backs Georgia has. But you see it in the NFL all the time. I mean, even with the Los Angeles Rams right now, Gurley doesn't have it going on. Well, the other guy, Anderson's able to handle it, pretty good as well. I think a lot of backs are going to look really good in Georgia's system. And that's why, I mean, you just don't have to force the issue with Zeus. You don't have to force that issue with him. You have the luxury of having other backs who can get the job done and maybe done at a higher level, immediately out of the box than he's going to be able to, after sitting out, over a year now.
Hey, Chip, that's a really fascinating conversation. We appreciate you writing provocative pieces at DawgNation.com. Thanks for your analysis and the other big subjects going on around the program. We'll look forward to hearing from you more at DawgNation.com this week. And, of course, we'll see you back here on DawgNation Daily again next week as well.
All right.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
I want to talk more about what Chip said about Zamir White in a moment, because I think this is kind of an interesting conversation. And by the way, I'm also going to open it up. Many of you have said, hey, BA, you got to start doing more comments during the regular portion of the broadcast show. We'll do some running back comments also coming up in a couple of minutes, too. So if you've got your thoughts on kind of who ranks below Herschel Walker's the great running back in all-time great Georgia history in this sort of week of running backs, given the fact that Gurley and Michelle are both in the Super Bowl. We'll do that coming up in a minute, too. Let me tell you about a couple of other big events happening this week, though, before we get there. Obviously, DawgNation really excited to let you know that coming up on Thursday and Friday, there are tremendous opportunities to meet former Georgia greats, two great former Georgia wide receivers. On Thursday, A.J. Green, the legendary former Georgia receiver who's had a great career with the Cincinnati Bengals, is going to be at the Kroger in Athens. That's 191 Alps Road from 4 to 6 p.m. there in Athens. So you're going to want to be a part of that. Now, this is going to be a huge crowd, so you got to understand that there's going to be a line, and you're going to be able to get a wristband. The first 150 people get those wristbands. You can't hold spots in line. So there's a little bit of crowd control stuff that's just got to be put in place because of the overwhelming demand for an event like this. But this Thursday, starting at 4 p.m., A.J. Green's going to be at the Kroger in Athens on Alps Road, 191 Alps Road. And then for the folks of you in Savannah, a lot of you have said, hey, BA, when is DawgNation or UGA going to have more stuff going on down there in the the coastal Georgia area, down in Savannah? Well, on Friday, the great former Georgia wide receiver Muhammad Massaquoi going to be on hand at the Kroger location, Savannah, at 318 Mall Boulevard. That's 318 Mall Boulevard in Savannah. Muhammad Massaquoi going to be on hand. Also, some crowd control measures in place. First 150 people in line do get those wristbands. But if you're in Savannah, a chance to meet Muhammad Massaquoi. In Athens, a chance to meet A.J. Green, and that is going to be a really, really fun thing coming up Thursday in Athens with A.J. and Friday in Savannah with Muhammad Massaquoi. Really good stuff. All right, we'll do our SEC through in a moment. Let me talk, though, about Zamir White before we get there. I thought that Chip's point was really interesting on that. And I think what this comes down to for me, as I said to him, if you're Georgia and you know you need that second back behind DeAndre Swift to be that complement to Swift, the way that Elijah Holyfield was this year and won't be there next year, the way that Sony Michel was to Nick Chubb the previous year, you can't just rubber stamp it and guarantee it and say it's going to be Zamir White and there's nothing to worry about. You obviously can't do that. If you're Georgia, you have to have a contingency plan in case White is still a little banged up, or if the injury lingers a little longer than we all wanted to. That's why James Cook is in the program. That's why Brian Herrien was, is going to stay. Herrien showed in the Sugar Bowl that he can be that guy. He did it on the short-term basis. He may now show that over the long haul. James Cook's obviously a pretty elite recruit himself. You've got to be able to do that. I'm a big believer that in sports, sometimes in baseball you hear about the idea of WAR, that stat that's out there, wins above replacement, the idea that, positions have kind of an inherent value. And at Georgia, the running back position kind of has an inherent value. I don't know who Georgia's starting running back is going to be in 2025, but he's going to have about 1,300 yards. And I don't know who the number 2 running back for Georgia is going to be in 2025, but that back's going to have about 1,100 yards. Assuming that the world doesn't end and Kirby's still at Georgia and Sam Pittman's still doing his thing and Dale McGee's still doing his thing, whatever the names of those players are, the first guy is going to have about 1,300 and the second guy is going to have about 1,100. That's just the way it's going to go in 2019 and in 2029. As long as this ship keeps rolling down the seas, those are the expected stats you're going to have. So if White is indeed dealing with an injury that's going to linger, then the odds are he won't emerge as the number 2 running back. Somebody else in this roster will overtake him before he gets on the field. So if you're a Georgia fan, that's the thing that you can probably feel good about it. If White's not ready to live up to the billing next year as the former 5-star guy he was out of high school, then in all likelihood it's either James Cook or Brian Herrien are getting the lion's share of those carries, because some running back somewhere is going to get 1,100 yards for Georgia in that number 2 position, because that's just become the sort of expected value of that running back position at Georgia. And over the long haul, these things have a way of working themselves out. So I do think that's going to be a pretty interesting thing to pay attention to. Let me squeeze in a couple of SEC stories here before we get some more comments from Georgia fans on the all-time pecking order of running backs, a conversation I think is kind of fun to have on a Monday like this. Florida fans are upset. And I wish I could tell you that I was upset with them, but y'all know there's nothing more on this show that we love, more so than an upset Florida fan. But Sal Sunseri has left Florida to go back to Alabama. That's a big-time hire for the Alabama Crimson Tide and a difficult name to replace for Florida. Well, the replacement, David Turner, that's apparently the name that's out there. A lot of reports say Turner is going to rejoin Dan Mullen. At one point in time, they worked together at Mississippi State. They will now work together apparently at Florida. Turner most recently was coaching defensive line at the University of Texas, San Antonio. This does not have the ring of a big-time hire to many Gators fans. This does not have the ring of, hey, we're going to go out there and recruit a bunch of elite defensive linemen. Florida fans are not happy about this. And this is the problem you're always going to run into with Dan Mullen. This is not a guy that has a history of recruiting a lot of elite players year after year. Certainly, he got a few good defensive linemen in his final couple cycles at Mississippi State. Obviously, Montez Sweat and Jeffrey Simmons are going to be, pretty respected NFL names coming up in this year's draft. But consistently over the long haul, that's not what Mullen did a lot of. When it comes to having to replace assistant coaches, a lot of what you're going to see from Mullen, his contacts with people like David Turner, the kinds of people that can't work at Georgia or can't work at Alabama. They can't work at the elite programs in the SEC. They could get a job at Mississippi State. Folks, that's who Dan Mullen has in his Rolodex. That's, you when you are in a position to hire, you hire people that you know. This is who Dan Mullen knows. And when it comes to sort of keeping up with the Joneses of the SEC, which includes UGA, over the long haul, Dan Mullen's going to have a really hard time doing that. Now, speaking of defensive line coach names, Brian Baker, most recently the defensive line coach at Mississippi State. There's also some rumors out there, some reports over the weekend that Alabama's looking to hire him. I don't quite know what position he's going to be coaching there. First of all, given a couple things. As I said, Sal Sunseri is on his way over, but also because as it stands right now, Alabama still employs a defensive line coach. His name is Craig Kuligowski. He was thought to be one of the best in the sport, but apparently he may be on the outs. Now, that's not necessarily a surprise to everybody, but in terms of the overall announcement, Kuligowski's still employed by Alabama, so a little bit of a sloppy look here by Alabama as it looks to replace coaches that are apparently still employed. And then one more SEC story to get to. LaMichael Petway was a receiver for Arkansas this past season. Decent stats overall. Had 500 yards receiving, or I should say 499 yards receiving, caught 4 touchdowns. As a graduate transfer, he visited Auburn over the weekend. So kind of an interesting story to pay attention. Georgia's obviously also potentially looking at some graduate transfers in that kind of wide receivers, tight end vein, maybe, certainly wide receiver for sure. So Auburn kind of doing the same thing, apparently, as it looks like LaMichael Petway from Arkansas was visiting Auburn over the weekend. We'll follow that story and for later, and for now, we'll make that your SEC through. All right, here on DawgNation Daily, as I said, sometimes we like to kind of stretch things out a little bit during the regular broadcast. For the people who don't get to, watch the show live, don't get to interact and comment, we like to bring some comments into the regular portion. And can I show the tweet one more time about the running backs? Tony Barnhart, and as I said, I love Tony. I'm going to try to have Tony on the show pretty soon to talk more about this. But he has his ranking of the top 15 Georgia running backs of all time. Now, I don't have time to get into the full top 15 list right now, but I did think it was interesting that Gurley only number 5 on this list, behind 1942 Heisman Trophy winner Frank Sinkwich at number 4. Chubb gets the number 3 spot, which is kind of interesting. Charlie Trippey, who, as Chip Towers said, was the number 1 overall pick in the 1947 NFL draft, he goes number 2 overall. And Herschel Walker, number 1 on this list, obviously. So my question was, if you're a longtime Georgia fan, a Georgia fan that cares about this kind of stuff, who would you rank as that back right below Herschel Walker? Because this is one of those debates that the top spot's not up for discussion. Obviously, Herschel is not just the best Georgia running back of all time. He's the best running back in college football history. But beyond that, who do you put next on that? My guess is that most Georgia fans are probably going to lean in the direction of Gurley in that number 2 spot, but I'll give you a chance to weigh in and say what you want to say here. Hard Times 57 on YouTube says Herschel is the all-time best. And he also mentions Nick Chubb in there as well as a part of that conversation. And listen, there's no doubt that Chubb belongs high on this list. That's a name that's got to be there. It's just a matter of, kind of where he belongs on that. Enrique Murillo also mentioned the name Nick Chubb. Brian Kephart actually thought that Musa Smith was a little too low on this list. For me, with all due respect to Musa, I actually thought there was a chance that Musa, who was the leading rusher for Georgia in 2002 when it won the SEC championship, I thought that Musa may be a little too high because his presence on this list takes a guy like Robert Edwards off the list. Now, I really think that Edwards is one of the more underrated players in Georgia history. This is a guy that scored 5 touchdowns in a game. This is a guy that became a first-round pick after the 97 season, taken by the New England Patriots. He gets hurt, and that kind of erases him from many people's memory banks. But the fact that Edwards isn't on this list, for me, is going to be a little bit of a problem. So if you want to weigh in with me on Twitter, at DawgNation Daily, you can give me your thoughts on that. If you're live on video, we'll obviously take more of your comments coming up. And I tell you what, if you want to get into the forum on this or in the comment section, we post the show at the world-famous DawgNation.com. We'll keep this conversation going a little bit this week because obviously Georgia running backs are on a lot of people's minds. For now, though, we need to get ready to wrap up the program, and we'll do so in nice fashion. First of all, letting you know, it has now been 821 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs, and we think that number is not only going to keep climbing over the course of this offseason, but it could potentially keep climbing for many years to come, and we will look forward to updating that for you every day here with our Gatorator Updater on DawgNation Daily, because good Georgia fans are indeed Gator haters. Let me also say congratulations going out to the Georgia men's basketball team for a really nice victory against Texas on Saturday. I watched the game on TV. First of all, from what I could tell, the crowd looked to be kind of in that game. That's kind of a nice home court atmosphere for the Dogs at Segment Coliseum. And really cool to hear Tom Crean kind of jokingly say, we're going to get revenge for the Sugar Bowl and then go out and do that. That's Crean coming across as a UGA fan and not just a coach. And I think that'll help endear him to the rest of the fan base. So good job by creating the Dogs. Congratulations, and we'll see you tomorrow here on DawgNation Daily. And on video, we can talk running backs if you want to. If you want to get into something else, we can also do that too. It'll be wide open here. Connor Riley and I are going to the Super Bowl opening night tonight, so we'll see Gurley and Michelle there. We hope to get a chance to kind of catch up with them and let you hear from both those guys tomorrow, as well as David Boss Andrews and kind of anything else that's going on. So I'm not doing a ton of Super Bowl-related stuff this week. For the most part, I'm going to try to stay out of downtown, but I am going over to see the opening night tonight, and I believe that's also on television. So y'all look for me and see if you see me there. Jason McCannon, on as far as his rankings goes, says it's Walker 1, it's Gurley 2, it's Michelle 3, Chubb 4, then Trippy 5. I mean, it's going to be hard to reach a consensus on the top 5. It is interesting to see Gurley there at number 2. I think Michelle and Chubb have a very strong argument to be in that top 5. But as Chip Tower said a moment ago, for a child of the 80s like me, and I mean more late 80s than early 80s, it's really hard to describe how good Rodney Hampton and Tim Worley were, and Lars Tate as well, for teams that, were not like 11-1 type teams. These were like 8-3, 9-3 type teams. Good, not great. But the backs themselves are terrific. If you look at the 1988 team, which was Dooley's last team, that team could have maybe done a little more than it did, had a chance to beat a good South Carolina team on the road, let it slip away, a couple things happen. But the 4 backs on that team, with, Alfonso Ellis was a fullback who played a long time in the NFL, Keith Henderson, who played a long time in the NFL, the 2 tailbacks were Hampton and Worley. That was a really, really good quartet of running backs. Really good quartet of running backs. Johnny Lester says Robert Edwards was one of the most electrifying running backs in UGA history. It really was. The Edwards story, if you're too young to know it, this was a guy who was just like floundering as a defensive back. They switched him to running back, and in his first game had 5 touchdowns. And then, so that's the 95 team. And, I've actually talked to Chip Towers on the show about this before. Not to go too far down memory lane here, but the 95 team was Goff's last year. But Bobo was his quarterback and got hurt. Edwards was the tailback. He got hurt. There were a lot of injuries on that team. By the end of the year, Hines Moore was playing quarterback. That's one of those teams where if you don't have those injuries, they probably win a lot of games that year. And who knows what happens beyond that. But you're not firing Greg Goff after 95 had, Edwards and Bobo not gotten hurt. A lot of those same guys were the ones that Jim Donnan used to great success in 1997. So that was a pretty talented offensive roster. It just so happened that a lot of those guys got hurt in 95. Bulldog Chris says Swift should be top 10. He's certainly working on that kind of career. There's no doubt. Cliff Payne says talent-wise, it's Herschel Walker, then it's Todd Gurley, hands down. I think the thing you got to get into with Gurley is, and we see examples like this in sports from time to time. If you're a longtime basketball fan, David Thompson may be an example of this, where, some people prove their greatness by their stats, and some people prove their greatness by their highlight reel. I think with Gurley, the stats aren't going to tell the story because it's actually a pretty limited amount of football overall, especially that 2014 season. He was taken off the field a lot because of the most asinine NCAA suspension of all time, and obviously his own injury, which he could not do anything to prevent. But it's one of those things where you had to just have to see Gurley. 2014, we are in kind of the Twitter, highlight, you're tweeting highlights in 2014, right? So, I mean, that's how the Gurley stuff was kind of passed around, and they just sort of spoke for itself. It's not the same thing as Nick Chubb, who did collect, stat after stat after stat. For Gurley, it's more about a collection of highlights he amassed. But those highlights, I do think, speak for themselves. In fact, let me bring in Connor Riley on this, one of our, a good bit younger than me. Connor, I'm guessing for your generation that does care about Georgia football, not just students of the university, but people who, care about the university even beyond, the time when they were alive to see these games. I'm guessing your generation thinks Gurley's number 2, correct?
I have eyeballs, so Gurley is number 2.
And it's highlight based, right? It's the kind of thing of when you watch him play, it's just, well, he's obviously great because you have to be great to do what he just did.
I mean, the 5 games to start the 2014 season, there hasn't been a Georgia running back or Georgia player who has played as well in a 5-game stretch as Gurley had. Starting with the Clemson game, him returning the kickoff, him just running through and around South Carolina, running for over 200 yards and picking up a big fourth down against Tennessee when everyone in the stadium knew he was getting the ball.
Yeah.
And then against Vanderbilt, just running for 170 yards, throwing a 51-yard touchdown pass. I mean, there was nothing that guy couldn't do that year. However, I'm a little disappointed that you have not brought this name up yet. Garrison Hurst.
Yeah.
1,500 yards in the 1992 season, I believe 19 touchdowns, came in third in the Heisman Trophy voting that year. Arguably the best full non-Herschel Walker season in Georgia football history.
Yeah, I mean, the honest truth is Georgia's got 2 Heisman winners. It's got Herschel and Sinkwich. The player that came the closest to winning the Heisman that didn't win the Heisman was probably Garrison Hurst. He won the Associated Press Player of the Year award for 1992. He won and back in 92, this is probably a bigger deal then than it is now. He won the ESPY as College Football Player of the Year. Gino Torretta wins the Heisman. There was also, why am I blanking? Boy, I've gotten terrible with names. Marshall Faulk, the San Diego State running back who went on to a long career with the Rams and the Colts in the NFL. He was the other elite player back in 92. But I thought Garrison Hurst, and this is probably no surprise, I thought he should have won the Heisman in 92. He was terrific. Another player on the Tony Barnhart list that I thought was probably a little too low was Noshawn Marino. Now, Georgia's got so many odd subplots when it comes to these running backs. In the case of Gurley, it's the fact that Georgia allowed him to be suspended for 4 games when it could have easily fought that and won. In the case of Marino, it's the fact they don't play him in 2006 for a team that really could have used an influx of talent. I mean, that team, imagine how much better the 2006 Georgia Bulldogs would have been had they played Noshawn Marino, who immediately became their best player running back-wise in 2007, but they chose not to do that back then. And then he only ends up playing in Georgia for 2 years. So it's kind of funny how there's like an odd subplot associated with a lot of these running backs. Jamie Bailey, thanks for the kind words. Appreciate that. Cliff Payne mentions Terrell Davis. Now, here's the thing about Terrell Davis. I was alive for all of this. Davis is obviously a Pro Football Hall of Famer, and by comparison, his college career seems smaller than that. Now, Tony Barnhart didn't have him ranked on the Georgia list, but if you're going to go just by the Georgia stuff, I'd probably move Davis down the list a good bit just based on the Georgia stuff because the Davis career was weird. For 92, he actually played behind Garrison Hurst, which you look at the pro football careers, you'd say that doesn't make any sense. But as Connor just mentioned, you go back and look at Hurst from the 92 season, nobody's starting over him. If you look at Davis's average, and Pro Football, Sports Reference has all these stats. I'm going to say he probably averaged something close to 9 yards a carry. So when he played well, but you're just not taking him off the field for Garrison Hurst. But then in like his final 2 years, which I think were 93 and 94, those were not good teams. Davis was hurt part of that time. Gosh knows Georgia probably had some issues along its offensive line. So I don't know that. Do you remember like a long time ago, ESPN Classic had the top 5 reasons you can't blame blah, blah, blah? I think there's probably a story to be told there of the top 5 reasons you can't blame Terrell Davis for not being better at the University of Georgia. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's the top 5 reasons you can't blame UGA for not getting more than Terrell Davis. I think there were probably some reasons for that, but there's no doubt that Davis's pro football career is gigantic in comparison to a fairly meager college career. He was also a transfer. He came over from Long Beach State when that program gave up football. Jacob Thompson says he's in jury duty today, so he's getting to watch. Well, Jacob, we know that there's nothing worse than jury duty, so we appreciate you letting us keep you company while you do that.
That's not true. Florida beating Georgia is worse than jury
Actually,
duty.
Yeah, I'd sit in jury duty for 6 months if I could avoid that. There's no doubt about that. Courtney Blackman says there should be a list for the quarterbacks. Jeff Santel wants to do the whole thing, so maybe we will end up doing that. Maybe we'll do all of those.
Who do you think is the number one?
Number one quarterback?
Yeah.
I don't want to get any quarterbacks today. We'll do.
You want to? All right. Way to avoid the
we'll
question.
Get a long time before September 1st.
Avoiding the question.
Oh, we get a long time before September 1st. Brandon Vernon on the subject of Ray Goff. The problem with Goff is he had. If you go back and look at the nucleuses of some of his teams, they were really, really talented. I'm sorry, Eric Zier. Do you want to talk about quarterbacks and where they rank? You'd be hard-pressed to play the position better than Zier did from 91 through 94. You talk about an unbelievable quarterback. He just was terrific. And Zier's working with Garrison Hurst and Andre Hastings. And for those of you that don't remember what a big recruiting win that was for Georgia when they got Hastings. And, the career he went on to have. I mean, if that's your three-headed monster on offense with Zaire and Hurst and Hastings, you are in business. And defense would include guys like Randall Godfrey and players who played in the NFL, and for whatever reason they just couldn't round out the rest of the roster. The 92 team was really close, really, really close to doing something pretty special. And, had a lot of turnovers against Tennessee. The Florida game was what it was, and there you go. Jerry Still says, if Gurley played the full 3 years, there's no doubt he would have been the second best running back, but Trippy is still number 2. So I know for virtually no one watching right now saw Charlie Trippy and Frank Sinkwich play in person. I'm actually sort of surprised that there's this consensus that Trippy was better than Sinkwich. Now, I'm talking about the 40s here, and none of us are experts on that. But I'm a little surprised. My understanding of Frank Sinkwich is he was a little bit of the, and this is a tough comparison to make, but he was a little bit of like the Michael Vick of his day, in that back in like single wing football, he was throwing the ball a little bit. Obviously, it was like, I may be wrong about this, but my understanding is he's like one of those single wing backs that's mostly running, but also throwing a little bit too. He was kind of like the 1942 version of a dual threat, which makes him kind of interesting. I also heard kind of an interesting story one time about these guys. A video producer that I know was telling me that, back then when you cut highlights, you literally cut highlights. You took a pair of scissors and you snipped the part that you want off the reel. So once you cut the reel, if you didn't take good care of what you cut, it was gone. So in terms of, the original video reel that would have existed for a guy like Frank Sinkwich, it actually, there was probably more then than exists now, but the way in which highlights were cut back then, you lost a lot of that kind of stuff. So if you go to like the archives that exist at UGA and you try to look at some footage for Frank Sinkwich, you're going to see a lot of, chopped together, spliced together stuff that's actually not the kind of highlights you want to see, because somewhere a long time ago, somebody actually cut the good stuff out and used it for something else. So, when we have the things we do have video for, we're actually pretty lucky to have that. Jay Bryan also mentions Lars Tate. One of these days, I'm going to bring in the picture. I was a kid when the Butts-Mehre Heritage Hall opened. This is back when Lars Tate still played on the team, and I loved Lars Tate. Huge fan of Tate. And I got a chance to go meet the players, and Tate snapped a photo with me. I still have that. I'm like a little fat, chubby kid, but that was always a very, very special moment for me there. Let me pop over to YouTube. We'll get a few more comments, and we don't have to talk about running backs the entire time if you don't want to. Hashim Spike says, if Trippy played beyond 1970, he would have been average as grits on his best day. The problem, though, is you can't really make that comparison, right? I mean, great was what great was then, and you can't really put, that guy in this era, this guy in that era, because, look, obviously, if he played today, he'd have the same advantages in terms of nutrition and weight training and things like that as anybody else would have had. So I get the idea that if you look at the athletes of today and compare them to the athletes of the 1940s, it's obvious who looks the most athletic, but it's sort of unfair to make that comparison because guys back then were, only using the best resource they had available to them back then.
Babe Ruth was dominating baseball, beer, and hot dogs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the perfect example of that.
I think Clayton Kershaw could strike out Babe Ruth on 2 pitches in today's day and age, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, so, I mean, I get all that. And basketball may be the worst of this because if you...
Imagine Bob Cousy trying to defend Russell Westbrook.
Like if you go back and watch these, like 50s era NBA things, I mean, it almost looks like the players don't even leave the floor. Like you said, you got like Bob Cousy. Like Cousy's what passed for athletic back then. So, there's only so much comparison of the generations that can be done. I still think though you got to have some reverence for the guys who were great in the in the past, especially in the case of Trippy because he's lived a pretty phenomenal life. Cliff Payne also mentioning Nick Chubb. And let me say one more thing about Chubb, and then we'll try to talk about something else for the last few minutes we're together. I think that Chubb, and y'all may disagree with this, I think that Chubb actually ends his Georgia career, believe it or not, as a little bit underrated. That when he goes to the NFL, there's this assumption that he's the inferior prospect in the comparison to Michelle. And some of this is, Georgia fans who had seen Michelle do so great in the Rose Bowl, they wanted Michelle to get more carries in the national championship game. And, they felt like that somehow, Michelle was just better equipped to handle the Alabama defense. Chubb did not have a great game against Alabama. There's no denying that. But I think when you look at the overall totality of Chubb's career, he was more than just the stats that he compiled. I mean, go back and watch him against Oklahoma. I mean, there's one moment in that game where, and some of y'all are better remembering the specifics of when it happened, but the angle with which the Oklahoma players had Chubb, I mean, he's literally like, this close to the ground. I mean, it's like he's like that far away from the ground. His body's all turned, and he shakes loose and somehow turns that into a touchdown. I think we can forget that Chubb was a really spectacular player. And I know there's this thought of, well, imagine if he never got hurt. How good could he have been at the end? That somehow he was explosive in 2014 in a way that he was not in the final stage of his Georgia career. And that may be true. And some of that's also colored by the fact that in 2016, it was just not a really good offensive line, and it obviously got way better the following year. But I think it's important not to let what might have been or could have been with Chubb distract us from what really was. And even after the injury, he still put together some pretty just mind-boggling highlights with regularity. I hope people truly appreciate how good he is. I don't have him as the number, certainly not the number 2 back in Georgia history. I may not have him as the number 3 or the number 4 back in Georgia history. But he is deservedly very highly regarded, for sure.
One, Chubb it wasn't the same player post-injury. I mean, you even look at yards per carry. He was averaging 7, 8 under Rick. And then, part of it was scheme change. Part of it was he just wasn't physically the same player. He was averaging 5 and 6 in those last 2 years. Mm-hmm. We use this word when talking about Hank Aaron. I think of the Georgia running backs, Nick Chubb is the most compiler. We mentioned Gurley and the highlight plays and all that. Chubb, just especially in those last 2 years, and really that sophomore year as well, just didn't have those sort of highlights. Part of it is because, other than the 17 team, the team he was playing on wasn't all that great. But that freshman season he was just running all over.
Yeah, he certainly was. I just think it's important when you go back and rewatch the Rose Bowl, and Georgia fans will be rewatching that game for 50 years. It's easy to fixate on Sony Michel because of what he did at the end, but it's also important to really watch how. I mean,
yeah,
Chubb showed in that game, and I realize it's the Oklahoma defense, but Chubb showed in that game that he was more than just a collection of stats. He was more than just a guy who put up big numbers. He showed in that game that even post-injury, and even with the the frustrating issues that he faced in 2016 with an offense that just hadn't quite rounded into form yet. He showed in that most important game in 2017 that he was really, really something special.
And I know a lot of people want to be high on Sony. Like, Sony couldn't do what Sony did if there isn't a guy like Chubb there to carry a majority of the load.
And I guess the other point here too is I love Sony Michel. Like he's my own offspring.
Gonna be a Super Bowl champion on Sunday.
Thank you, Connor. Appreciate that. I guess for me though, when you watch what Chubb did for the Browns this year. Clearly Michel's on the better team right now, but for me, the jury is still very much out on who's going to end up being the better of those two pro running backs. And that I thought that Chubb did plenty in his rookie season to really insert himself in the conversation of still potentially being the better of the two pros.
I would agree. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see, Chubb, he does play with Baker, whereas Sony, once Brady does decide to retire, it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But right now, I think after year one, I think you have to call it a wash. Ironically, the Patriots don't use Sony Michel as a pass-catching back. They sort of use him how Georgia used Nick Chubb, and Chubb has been a little bit more involved as a pass catcher in his time at Georgia.
Brandon Vernon says, Connor makes me a Rams fan. Yeah, Brandon, I know where you're coming from on that. Gary and Christian Gulisano also says, B.A., Jonathan Ledbetter could get 500 yards rushing behind our offensive line. These new running back stats are going to be off the wall in the near future. And, Gary, that's one of the reasons why, and Christian, that's one of the reasons why I'm supportive of Zamir White, even sight unseen. Because as I said before, there is a certain value the Georgia running back position has, over the course of, the time that it's been established. That starter is going to get about 1,300 yards for you. That backup is going to get about 1,100 yards. And as you said, given the way the offensive line is only expected to get better, those overall position values may actually go up in the future. I certainly don't see reason to believe they're going to go down right now. That's why I would keep a level of optimism about White, even though Chip is accurate to point out that nothing is guaranteed there. Chip's facts on that could not be disputed, that nothing's guaranteed, injuries are tough, and being an elite prospect living up to the billing on its own is tough. Those facts are not in dispute. And yet, if you give me the choice of a running back at UCLA as a former 5-star getting, 1,300 yards, or that same player playing at Georgia, the chances of it doing that at Georgia are just greater given the track record that Georgia's had doing that. One of the things that's really interesting about college football stats, and I don't mean to go down a wormhole here, but one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at the overall projections based on 5-year averages, do you know that college football is actually more predictive than the NFL? Now, that shouldn't be true, given the fact that players are only allowed to stay 4 years. So if you're looking at 5 years, you're cycling through rosters completely over the course of that time. But in college football, if you want to predict someone, a team's stats, the 5-year average previous to that is actually more predictive for college football than it is the NFL. That's a fascinating, sort of scenario that exists because, track records just matter over time. Coaches change, positions change, player names change, but track records still matter. And that Georgia running back track record is one that has some permanence to it. Eric DeVorncy says, I'm not sure how Gurley was in the starter from day one. He says, well, I kind of have an idea. But, it's easy to forget. Keith Marshall was the more highly touted of that tandem when they came out of high school. That's one of those examples of, while the recruiting services mostly get it right, in the case of Gurley and Marshall, it obviously looks like the wrong guy was the 5-star there. Now Marshall was another guy that dealt with some injuries. He could have certainly had a long NFL career if not for that. But even when they were both healthy, it was pretty clear that Gurley was the better of the two players, and yet that's not the way that they were reviewed coming out of high school.
I will say, Keith Marshall, I believe, is the second highest running back ever signed coming out of high school by Georgia. Freshman year, 6.5 yards a carry, 8 touchdowns, 750 yards.
That's a pretty good year.
Yeah,
that's a pretty good year.
Yeah, and to say Gurley wasn't the starter from day one, he was the team's leading rusher. So it's not like Georgia didn't give him the ball enough. So, and actually, even in that Alabama game, Gurley had over 20 carries in that game, whereas Keith Marshall only had like 2 or 3 touches. So Gurley was the starter that year.
Jeremy Chapman says, BA, I think that Kenny McIntosh is going to get short yardage carries this season, with Cook being the change of pace back and Swift as the starter, because I don't see Zeus getting a lot of those carries. So we'll see about that in terms of why. And, Jeremy, I think it's interesting that you're bringing Kenny McIntosh into this discussion. The honest truth is I don't quite know what to expect from McIntosh yet. Now, obviously, your description of how he might be used certainly makes the most sense. I guess my issue is, if you really listen to smart people on this, I think for most people they're going to say that the reason that Georgia had issues at the goal line last year was not the fact they didn't have enough of a power running game to cross the goal line. It's that they kind of relied on those kind of very simple plays too much. That's the one example where people have pointed to Jim Chaney and say, you got to be more creative. Knowing that you run compact offensive sets virtually all the time, they're even more compact down at the goal line because you can't blow the top off the defense. That's when you've got to be creative and you got to throw the ball a little bit more. And I guess I've kind of bought into that line of thinking. Not that I wouldn't, welcome Kenny McIntosh making the contribution to Georgia in 2019. I guess I'm of the belief that for Georgia to be better at the goal line than it was in some key moments last year, it's got to throw the ball a little bit more. And I don't mean back corner fades because I think those are relatively low percentage plays. But this is one of the reasons why I want like a really good tight end and a really good big receiver who can turn around and post you up like a power forward and throw the ball to the front of the goal line and just, score a touchdown easily. So one of the things I'm looking to see Georgia do more of in 2019, one of the differences I'd love to see from Coley in comparison to Chaney is throwing the ball more at the goal line.
In that similar vein, so we talked about running backs to lead the show today. Would you rather see Georgia sign more top 10 running backs in 2020? Because Georgia's probably going to sign 2, and I think there's a pretty good chance that Georgia has multiple guys who finish in the top 10. That they've done with Keith Marshall, Sony and Nick, Zamir and James Cook. Does Georgia sign more top 10 running backs in 2020 or top 10 wide receivers in 2020? Okay, I know receivers are your biggest and favorite concern.
So here's where I have to get philosophical for 2 seconds. The key to success in life is working in your strengths, not your weaknesses. You want to mitigate your weaknesses and always make sure your strengths remain strong. And by the way, you see this with NFL teams over and over and over again. Whether they should or they shouldn't, teams always draft to stay strong when they're already strong. They have identities and they want to maintain and establish those identities. That also works in life as well. You know, you're good at math, you're not good at, reading and writing, then you find a career that's going to, take advantage of your mathematical skills, not necessarily your language skills. That's the way that life goes. Connor's right that I've talked over and over again about how at some point in time, Georgia got to address its main weakness, which is, I think, its wide receiver recruitment in comparison to other stuff. However, Georgia's most important job for 2020 is making sure what has been its strength remains its strength. So as much as I want to see Georgia add to its wide receiver repertoire, find a way to get those guys more involved in the offense, I do think that's crucial. It's not, for me, more crucial than going out and finding, whether it be Marshawn Lloyd, who Jeff seems to really like, Kendall Milton, who I've been impressed with, or, whatever Zachary Evans turns out to be. I guess Bowman is the other name you might mention in that discussion. Whatever these guys kind of, whichever of these guys end up being the guy, getting that next generation of that, especially given the fact that Georgia missed on Trey Sanders this year, that's Georgia's most important job. It's not Georgia's biggest position of need necessarily, but it's Georgia's most important job. You've got to make sure that you maximize your strengths. You've got to make sure your strengths remain strong. It'll help you in football and in life.
Only thing
I told you I was going to get philosophical about that.
Only thing I disagree on there is that Georgia missed on Trey Sanders. I don't think Georgia missed on a guy who thinks he's going to win the Heisman next year.
So there may be some personality things about him you don't like, but that's a head-to-head recruiting win that I want to see Georgia win. I feel like you can just negative recruit Alabama right now. And I know some people think that that's what I do for a living, but it's not. But I do think that if you wanted to negative recruit against Alabama, it ought to be fairly easy to do. The same way that people want to look at Georgia and say, oh, you don't want to go there if you're a wide receiver, they're not going to use you. How can you not say that? And I don't want to get into a whole thing about this because it's water under the bridge. But I feel like that ought to be a situation when you say, oh, they're a pass-happy offense now. They're a Big 12 offense. You really want to go there? You really want to do that? I feel like you got to be able to plant that seed into a running back's head right now.
So I will say to counter that, it's easier to negatively recruit against Alabama now after they got whipped by Clemson than it was before early signing day with Trey Sanders. Because, at that point, everything's still going great. Obviously, I think Najee Harris probably wishes he had gotten more carries over the course of the year, but, negative recruiting Alabama has certainly ratcheted up in the weeks since they lost to Clemson.
All right, a couple quick ones we're going to go. James Fulgham says Harrion needs more touches. I 100% agree with that. I am very high on Brian Harrion right now. Now, you can't be high on everybody equally. I do realize that. But as of right now, I'm reserving the right to be very bullish on Harrion's 2019. I just think that, once again, as I've been saying, positions have an inherent value. The Georgia running back position is worth X number of yards. As a starter, X number of yards as a number 2 guy. If Brian Harrion ends up winning the competition to be that number 2 guy, then you might as well go ahead and pencil him in for the same yardage that Elijah Holyfield got last year. It's going to be very close to that. And I think there's a really good chance that Harrion just ends up being I would not overlook him as a competitor in this whatsoever. He's nowhere near the same level of recruit. Nationally, he's nowhere near as famous. I think that Brian Harrion is a very interesting name. A very interesting name. I also agree with Philip Jordan Wells, who says Sanders was a miss, but the 2020 boys will make up for it. And that's kind of my thought on this, too. To me, it was a miss, but it's not the kind of miss that can't be overcome by going out and doing in 2020 what you should have done the first time. Beth Starrett also agreeing on Harrion, saying that Harrion is a beast. Yeah, I'm not ready to go on record saying what he will do. I'm just trying to plant the seed about what I think he could do, potentially, for sure.
James Bryant with a good comment. We all need more touches in life.
We all need more touches.
We do.
That's good. I like that. That's not bad at all. All right. Double R says Harrion's a very solid back. Go look at his freshman year highlights. Yeah. I mean, you look at the North Carolina game. Look at the Texas game. The first game and the most recent game he's played at Georgia. I mean, that kind of tells you what you need to know right there. Cameron Merrill also says free D-Rob. I'm high on D-Rob here too. Listen, I'm not going to turn my back. I mean, I've gone down a pretty long road with my belief that Robertson will eventually be a player at Georgia, and I was as disappointed as anybody when it turned out to be true this year. But I've gone too far to come back now. I mean, I'm on this turf now. I got to stake that claim. All right.
Can't forget about Dominic Blaylock either.
Yeah, listen.
I mean, I'm the driver of his bandwagon more so than you are, but no, it's okay.
Probably more as an inside receiver as a freshman, are you thinking?
I could certainly see him playing outside. I mean, it depends.
As a freshman?
Yeah, why not?
I don't know. I mean, we'll see. I mean, I'd love to see that.
I mean, he's played against the big boys in 7A Georgia football. I don't. I mean, obviously, yes, it's going to take some time for him to get acclimated, and certainly physically, just in terms of getting in the weight room and gaining strength. But he's we saw him at the Touchdown Club of Atlanta last week. He's a no nonsense guy. Like, he is coming here to play football. That is
true.
Well.
Yeah. He's not goofing around here. He's not coming to Georgia to go. Whatever. He's coming to be focused. And now also Miller H in the YouTube comment section mentions Tommy Bush, and I know that name always comes up. We kind of joke about that, but I mean, it is fair to say that if I told you what I want a Georgia receiver to look like, you would say, "B, they already got that guy. He's Tommy Bush. He definitely looks like what you want the Georgia receiver to look like." And I think he's going to get every chance to do what a lot of our commenters want to see him do. This is one of those things where, one of two things is true. Either he was buried on a depth chart this year that involved two guys who are about to be in the NFL, or he was kind of redshirted for a reason. And we don't yet know what that's going to be. The J.J. Holloman, or I say redshirt. Honestly, I don't know if he redshirt or not. But, the J.J. Holloman, spec is an interesting one. Holloman was not doing much in 2017, and I thought he was terrific for Georgia in 2018. Really, really spectacular player. It was think about the block he had on the DeAndre Swift touchdown run against Kentucky. Think about the one-handed grabs. I've always been impressed with the strength of Holloman. I think he's a really strong guy. He grabs the ball out of the air. He uses his body really well. He makes body position. So if Holloman could have the light come on for him in year two, people are going to say, well, Tommy Bush could do the same thing, and he very well might be able to do that. Jacob Thompson also says the tight end John Fitzpatrick's going to surprise some people this year. I really hope that Fitzpatrick gets his chance, because I do like Georgia in two tight end sets. And I think as that second tight end, Fitzpatrick could really be that guy. Remember, when you're as tall as he is, adding strength presumably is just a little easier to do because you got a big long frame to hang it on. And I think that could be a really, really interesting thing.
Fitzpatrick, a Marist alum, also a Marist alum, Sean McVay, Rams head coach.
It all comes full circle. Super Bowl week here in the city of Atlanta. Dapper Dan also mentions Trey Blount. And I would love to see – I know there's only 11 guys on the field and one football and blah, blah, blah. I'd love to see Trey Blount get his chance because, Blount was with us at a Marlowe's broadcast, and, he talked about his willingness to block, and he knew you got to block to get the rock. Well, every time he's been on the field, he's been a good blocker. And the couple times they've thrown it to him, he's caught it. I mean, if you're Trey Blount, you look at your, playing time at Georgia and say, what else do you want me to do? I'm physical. I catch the football. I think there are plenty of teams that Blount could play for. I think there are plenty of teams that Blount could be an impact wide receiver for. I would love to see him get that chance at Georgia because I think he's a pretty impressive guy. I do. Jacob Thompson also mentioned Kearis Jackson. That's another name to think about for sure. Miller H., and we'll make this the last comment because we really do got to go. He says, thoughts on if Jake Fromm's going to stay for a fourth year? Boy, that's going to be a really interesting story because I really don't want to see Georgia starting another freshman in 2020. I'm sort of ready for Georgia to get out of the freshman quarterback conversation. But obviously, if Fromm were to leave, it makes recruiting a guy like Robbie Ashford easier to do. Ashford's going to announce in March, so we're not going to really know, the future with Fromm then. But the trajectory certainly probably weighs into Ashford's thinking. That's the 2020 quarterback right now that I think I like better than anybody else. I really like him a lot. I know he's a baseball player, and that's complicated and whatever, but you think about that. I guess there's also the issue that, if Fromm just lit the world on fire next year and left as a junior, which, by the way, there are plenty of national websites that say that is what he's going to do. It's, if you talk to the national media, they assume it's more likely that he will go just because that's what good junior quarterbacks often do. So, sometimes I think maybe Georgia fans don't consider that possibility as much. It could be that Georgia's in the transfer portal after that, looking to see who pops up. Like the kid from Texas A&M that popped in there the other day. That may be whatever version of that exists for the 2020 season. That may be the directions Georgia's going for a year while a guy like Robbie Ashford gets ready. Quarterback is going to be really interesting at Georgia to see if the program adopts. I mean, if you based on what Kirby Smart said in the past, the plan is there is no plan. Maybe it's about time for Georgia to have a quarterback plan and some sort of like succession plan for what happens for Georgia past Jake Fromm, because one way or another, the Fromm career is going to come to an end sooner rather than later.
Two things. One, like you were saying, I wonder if Georgia's 2020 or 2021 starting quarterback is on another college roster right now.
And if it is, I'd sort of be fine with that. I want to, see Georgia continue to recruit really good, high school quarterbacks. But in terms of, while Georgia's a really talented roster, you don't necessarily have to have Trevor Lawrence at quarterback. You just have to have a guy that's, competent and capable. And the transfer portal may be a better place to get that in some years than the high school ranks, especially if you have a guy leave after a junior season. I'd kind of be okay with that. I don't necessarily want it to be Jalen Hurts, but I'd sort of be okay with it being, somebody of that caliber, I guess.
And my second point, I mentioned before we were at the Touchdown Club banquet last week, and Jake was there, and his younger brother Dylan was getting honored. And when the MC, he was giving out a Coach of the Year award to Bainbridge's coach. Bainbridge beat Dylan's Warner Robins team in the state championship game. When the presenter was talking about that game, Dylan visibly got very choked up and his eyes were welling up. Winning means a lot to that family.
Yeah.
And winning a championship means a lot to Jake Fromm. So I certainly would not be surprised at all if Georgia, if he has a great year, but Georgia somehow doesn't win a championship, like Aaron Murray in 2012. He decides to come back for another year and try and win a title at Georgia.
That's a really interesting statement, Connor. I missed that from the banquet the other night. That's a really interesting thing to notice and say. I really appreciate that. All right, we got to get ready to go. We are going to go to Super Bowl opening night tonight. We'll have some stuff for that for you tomorrow morning here on DawgNation Daily, and a lot of recruiting stuff as well. By the way, if you are just joining us, I want to make sure you're aware, and this is not news I love saying, but we're just going to have to let as the right phrase to say discretion's the better part of valor. Does that phrase fit here? We are going to postpone our event tomorrow night at the Marlowe's Tavern in Kennesaw. Here in the Atlanta area, there's the expectation there could be bad weather tomorrow. The truth is, I'm not a meteorologist for a living. I can't speak to what it is going to be, but the thought is that it could be, and therefore we are going to postpone this. So if you're planning on being with us in Kennesaw tomorrow, I'm really sorry to say that. We'll look forward to being with you in Kennesaw very soon. We also have another Marlowe's event to announce very soon as well that you're going to want to be a part of. So that is kind of where we are on all of that, and we will give you more details on when we're coming back to Kennesaw when we can tell you more about that. But for now, though, the Marlowe's event that was scheduled for Kennesaw tomorrow is going to be postponed because of the expectation of weather. So we want to make you aware of that. I'll see you tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily.